Hey guys, Via Psych here. Now, of course, I was just thinking because, some actually younger adults ask me this. They actually do sometimes ask me about the 90's, and sometimes I kind of make at the same time, I'm just kind of whatever about age. At least for the moments, because it's not like I'm real old yet anyway. But, it's just funny because just some of the younger adults asking me questions about the 90's has made me realize how old I really am, though, at the same time, and how much has changed. You know what I mean? Even though I'm still only like 30 years old. I was born, 1990. That was the year I was born. And in the early 90's, I remember it was still kind of basically like the 80's, is basically what the early 90's were like. And styles from the 80's were still kind of coming through. I'd say a lot of the styles and the ways that, the 80's were kind of stuck around until maybe about the mid 90's is when they kind of had that big fashion trend that you tend to see associated with the 90's. But, that era of style only lasted for like, what, a year or two at best during the mid 90's. The bright colors and everything. But yeah, Mutant Ninja Turtles. I remember I used to watch the Mutant Ninja Turtles when I was a kid. I still remember watching that old ass show, that old ass animated show, Cowabunga. Ugh. I remember what the Ninja Turtles back in the day. They were so fucking big. I mean, the Ninja Turtles back then were so fucking huge, and nowadays you hardly ever hear about the Ninja Turtles anymore. But it was a big deal back then. I mean, it really was. I remember when I was used to live in Virginia, used to watch the TV. This is before they had widescreen TVs back then. They pretty much only had full screen back then. Oh, the change. Just even little changes like that over time. My God. And now we have like fucking 4K TV, 4K TVs. We're going on to 8K now. 8K TVs. I mean, Jesus fucking Christ. I remember when, was it the late 90's at least, they finally started coming out with HD. I mean, jeez. That, and yeah, we, of course, eventually, as I grew up and I was in kindergarten, I remember I had the N64, or the Nintendo 64, as they call it. I remember my grandparents had to wait in a long ass line just to get us that Nintendo N64. I mean, yeah, that was also somewhat of a big deal. My brother actually still has a Nintendo 64, by the way. It actually still works. Crazy, isn't it? Machinery really did work more back then. I mean, nowadays consoles don't really hardly last anymore. I remember some of my friends when they got an Xbox 360 next decade. That, man, these consoles really didn't last. But sometimes that was actually their fault. They didn't really take care of this stuff very well. But enough about that. I also remember the dance era, as they called it during the 90's. I actually used to dance. I don't ever dance anymore. But I remember I used to like to go out and dance, with my friends sometimes, with the music back then. There was a lot of, house at the time, house music, dance music. There's a ton of dance music at one point, just a ton of it. You don't you don't hear that music anymore, if not hardly anymore. I mean, there's just so many 90's hits that I actually still remember that I never even hear anymore. I've actually had trouble looking for them on the internet, at least with some of the music that is. Like, it's just funny how things change. But, at the same time, there's also a lot of things that haven't changed, to be frank. I mean, sometimes I know people will say a lot of good things about the 90s, but, to be frank, I mean, there's a lot of the issues from the 90s that actually have moved over in even today's world. Like, I remember at best, like at the time in the 90s, I remember used to, at least in the earlier 90s, you used to actually be able to, I used to see people, they would just quit jobs. They used to take advantage of jobs way too much in the 90s. And I also always remember the phrase, just get a job back then. Nowadays, I hardly ever hear people say that anymore. I hardly ever see or hear people say that kind of stuff anymore. Like, oh, just get a job. Because it really did used to be simple to get a job. Like, it really was. I remember people used to get really bad interviews at jobs and they would still get the job. It's just insane. And people used to they would just quit a job one day, sometimes a good job, and then they would just get another job within the next week, just like that. And the jobs, I remember, they used to have more security than the average job nowadays. Nowadays, you have to always worry about being replaced. It's just insane. What One thing that I hear a lot of people say about the 90s as well is that, how people don't get married anymore like they used to in the 90s. And of course, I'm here to say that that's actually kind of full of crap. I mean, people maybe got married more so in the 90s, but I actually do remember, even in the mid 90s, people talking about how people aren't getting into marriage anymore. And as the decades have moved on, it seems less and less people are getting married and having kids. But, that's just how things are sometimes. I would say officially when the 90s died is when 9/11 happens. When 9/11 happened, that was it. The 90s were gone. Because I remember the year 2001, it was still kind of like the 90s, actually. I remember when that show Battle Bots came out in 2001. And when 9/11 happens, that BattleBots show that I'm talking about got canceled because people were concentrating so much on 9/11 at the time, and it was such a big frickin' deal that all these shows from the 90s, they just ratings went way down. People weren't watching them at the time. And that was officially the end of the 90s right there. Was 9/11, let me tell you. Some kids ask me about that too. It's crazy. In fact, I heard some kids actually try to refer to 9/11 versus the COVID-19 crisis. They're like, oh, the whole COVID thing is bigger than 9/11. And I was just like, do you even know how big 9/11 was? How big of a deal that was? That was the third time in recorded history that America had been attacked. Only the third time, I think, anyway. So it was a big fucking deal. It was a big fucking deal, let me tell you. But enough about that, of course. I remember, the way things just look so different now. They just look so damn different. All the shit that we used to worry about at the time. I'd say a lot of the problems that we used to worry about at the time are just forgotten now. Let me tell you. What else can I talk about the 90s? Remember in the late 90s when the first, I think it was maybe the late 90s was like when the Xbox came out. I remember the first PlayStation when that came out. I remember when that first Xbox came out. I really wanted that at the time. there there was seriously almost nothing to do back then. You know, we didn't have online like we did. We started to get online games, you know, when the Xbox came out. But before then, we didn't have hardly any online games. If you wanted online at the time, you had to have a computer to play online games for a time. I remember. But, you know, also, that's also when I remember the internet became popular was in the 90s. And I remember when I was a kid, it's like, hey, what are you doing on the internet? Blah, blah. I was like, oh, wait, what are you guys talking about this internet? You know what I mean? And, you know, there's like, oh, yeah, here's the web browser and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, of course, I had to learn about the internet in the late 90s, more so, of course, as it became more and more popular. I remember, man, this is before YouTube. All the shit that we used to do on the internet, like they didn't even have YouTube back then. I mean, and they hardly had any like internet videos at the time. Lots of it was just images, and even then, I remember the images on the internet would take forever to load. I mean, these computers were slow as fuck. Let me tell you. They were slow. I remember you don't need it anymore, but back in the day, there used to be a lot of appliances that used to sell like faster internets, like lots of deals that used to sell faster internet at the time. You don't need that with computers that they make nowadays because they actually load the internet just fine nowadays. But back then, man, the internet was fucking slow. Also, remember how big the cameras were at the time. Like, I remember even a nice camera at the time, it was like on your fucking shoulder. You had to carry around these big ass cameras if you were recording something in the 90s. You know? They were, I mean, there were some hand cameras that they had at the time, but they weren't very good quality cameras, right? They're like the lenses and stuff weren't very good on them. But nowadays, I mean, as far as cameras go, I mean, this thing here, the camera lens on this and on these smartphones nowadays, like you don't even need a camera anymore with these fucking smartphones nowadays. I mean, and look at how big this fucking thing is. It's like smaller than the size of the tip of my finger. And this camera on this is possibly even better than the camera you're looking through now. I mean, it's just amazing how advanced with that we've become. And nowadays we have all the smartwatches and stuff. I remember it was like 2006, I think, when they finally came out with the you know the first Apple Watch, or so to say smartwatch back then for Apple. But you know, of course, that was outside of the 90s. That was like 6 years after the 90s. I mean, just utter shits. I don't do anything that I used to do in the 90s. I don't do anything that I used to do because of the way the times have changed. God, I remember also the Power Rangers were popular at the time when I was a kid. Just fun little memories, you know. Back when the Power Rangers were popular. Man. Also, I remember back when we actually used to go to playgrounds. I think that is kind of a thing that has changed, although kids sometimes do still go to playgrounds. It's not like it used to be. Not like it used to be. But, I could talk all day about the changes from the 90s and what it used to be like, but to say what the 90s were really like as a whole, it could take me up to 24 hours just making a video, let me tell you. Just all of the changes. Also remember when I used to go to Toys R Us in the 90s. Now Toys R Us isn't here anymore. Not anymore. Kids don't buy as many toys as they used to. Anyway, I will stop right there, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.